So we have Martirosyan here in the button with just over 40 big blinds and ace-4 suited. Now Dan Smith is in the big blind with a short stack, just 16 big blinds, so he's going to open probably a little bit wider than usual. And Patrick Antonius is in the small blind with a slightly bigger stack with king-6 suited. Now he's going to want to play a lot of hands here with Dan Smith in the big blind. He will have some traps, some premium hands, as well as some strong hands that he doesn't necessarily want to free bet get it in for 40 big blinds against Arta. He is incentivized to play faster when he covers Arta because he can obviously win his bounty, but he will have some traps here. Now Dan Smith has an interesting spot in the big blind. You can see on the left here, this is what a similar spot in a vanilla tournament might look like. You can see there's a lot of free bet non-all-in with hands like aces, kings, queens, whereas on the right in a similar spot in a PKO tournament we're pretty much just playing shove, call or fold, and the shoving range is a lot more linear just for value. Hands that perform well when we get called by a wide range, so we can see we shove hands like king, queen off, whereas in a vanilla tournament we just call that hand, because in a bounty tournament we're going to get called a lot by worse hands like king, jack off or king 10 suited. And you can see the hands like 10-9 suited, jack-9 suited are shoved in the vanilla tournament because we're going to get better hands to fold like offsuit broadways, whereas if we're going to get called wide then those hands don't perform quite as well, so we just call them. Dan Smith moves all in here for about 16 big blinds, and now back to Arta, and we can see that with the mystery bounty being worth about 662,000 chips, he'd be calling here to win a pot of just under 2.4 million, so he only needs about 29% equity to break even against Dan Smith. But of course he does have to factor in Patrick in the small blind, who will have some traps, and it would be a significant blow to Martirosyan's stack, so he does have future game considerations. So perhaps Arta might want more like 38-39% equity to call. You can see here that ace-4 suited is just about getting the right price. In fact, we could go with this range of hands here if we say we won about 38%. So you can 4-bet shove quite wide, which is what he does. And Patrick has to get out of the way with the king-6 suited. Down to the final 10 players, and this table is currently playing out four-handed. You can see that Kim has about 17 big blinds and he's comfortably covered by the rest of the table. Now he's dealt ace-6 off in the cutoff. Now typically in a vanilla tournament we'd look to do almost no open shoving from this stack depth. In a bounty tournament we can start to shove some hands because we're going to get called wider behind and we're going to get shoved on more often when we just min open ourselves. Nevertheless, I think ace-6 off is just a bit too weak to shove here. We're going to get called quite often by better hands behind, and we do have ICM considerations. And now it falls to Nacho Barbero in the small blind with pocket fours. He's got about 50 big blinds here, and it's a tricky spot because he has Danny Tang with a big stack behind, although he does cover Danny, which makes it a little bit less disastrous when we get it all in against him. We can see the mystery bounty is currently worth about 907,000, so he'd be calling to win a pot of nearly 3.1 million chips. So he needs about 32% equity to break even against Kim's range, and then when we factor in we have Danny behind and future game considerations, maybe we want more like 38-39%. It's tough to know what range Kim will be shoving for 17 big blinds, but perhaps if we give him something like this, with some of the strongest hands taken out and some of the weaker hands taken out, then we can see we've got about 43.5% equity against this range, which is more than enough to go with. In perhaps a worst case scenario, he starts shoving queens, he folds some of these weaker hands, so it has quite a tight range. Then we still have 37.6%, which is not too bad. But Nacho does decide to fold, perhaps future game considerations played into it. He'd be the shortest stack at the table if he loses. But I think a lot of players there would decide that with the bounty equity and the chance to run up a big stack going into the final table, they would take the spot. Especially as we can see that the dollar value of the mystery bounty is a lot higher than most of the pay jumps. We're now down to 9 players remaining. We have Hecklen here in the hijack with about 13.5 big blinds. He may have some non-all-in raises here, but perfectly reasonable in a mystery bounty tournament with this short stack just to play a whole range as a shove. And King Queen off is strong enough to go with. It folds to David Yan in the small blind. And we can see that although Haxton has a big stack in the big blind, we do comfortably cover him. So we can go after this bounty quite wide. And with the mystery bounty being worth nearly 1 million chips, the pot would be worth 3.3 million if we end up heads up against Hecklen. So we need about 32% equity to break even against him. But with Ike behind, maybe we want a little bit more, maybe more like 38% equity. So if we give Hecklen a range of something like this, if we assume he might raise non-all-in with kings and aces and some of the weaker hands, we can see that King Jack suited is getting over 43% against a potential range for Hecklen here. In fact, Jan could go as wide as this. Perhaps we'd fold some of the weaker hands here just in case our opponent's range is a bit tighter than we assume. But even in a worst case scenario where our opponent doesn't have some of the weaker hands and he just shoves kings and aces, we still have nearly 40% equity against this range with King Jack suited, so more than strong enough to go with.